At my granddaughter's wedding, I was handed a name tag that didn't have my name on it, just 4 words printed in elegant calligraphy, the absent old lady. I smiled when I saw it, the way you do when something is so unexpected your mind refuses to process it right away, and for a moment I thought perhaps it had been meant for someone else, someone who hadn't shown up, someone who deserved the quiet judgment those words carried, but then I noticed the seating chart, my place carefully arranged at table 12, and the matching card resting beside a glass of untouched champagne, waiting for me, confirming that no, this wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate, planned, and executed with the same attention to detail I had once admired in my granddaughter Olivia, the same girl I used to pick up from elementary school every Friday afternoon, the same girl whose college tuition I quietly covered when her parents said money was tight, the same girl who now stood across the ballroom in a white silk gown that I had paid for, laughing under crystal chandeliers as if nothing in the world had ever been given to her without condition, and certainly not by me. I adjusted the pale blue jacket I had chosen for the occasion, something tasteful, something appropriate for a grandmother who didn't want to draw attention, though attention, it seemed, had already been drawn to me in a way I hadn't anticipated. A woman passing by glanced at my name tag, her eyes lingering just long enough to register the words before she offered me a tight, polite smile, the kind reserved for uncomfortable situations, and I returned it just as politely, because that's what I've always done, maintained composure, preserved appearances, protected the illusion of a happy family even when the truth was far more complicated. I stepped further into the reception hall, the soft music of a string quartet filling the air, glasses clinking, voices rising and falling in cheerful conversation, and everywhere I looked there were small reminders of my presence in this wedding, the floral arrangements I had insisted on upgrading, the catering menu I had personally reviewed, the venue deposit I had covered when Diane said they were a little short this month. Diane, my daughter-in-law, who stood near the bar speaking to a group of guests, her posture relaxed, her smile effortless, as if she had not orchestrated something so quietly cruel. I watched her for a moment, wondering if she would look over, if she would notice me standing there wearing that label, but she didn't, or perhaps she chose not to, and that distinction mattered more than I cared to admit. I made my way to the table assigned to me, each step measured, each breath steady, the heels of my shoes tapping softly against the polished floor, and when I reached my seat, I placed my clutch beside the plate and sat down, folding my hands in my lap as if everything was exactly as it should be, because reacting, making a scene, asking questions in the middle of a celebration, that would only confirm whatever narrative they had already decided to attach to me, that I was difficult, dramatic, perhaps even ungrateful, and I had no intention of giving them that satisfaction, not today, not here. I glanced again at the name tag, the ink dark and precise, no smudges, no hesitation in the lettering, someone had taken their time with it, and I wondered briefly who had written it, whether it had been Diane herself or Olivia, whether they had laughed while deciding on the wording, whether they had practiced writing it out before settling on the final version. The thought settled somewhere deep in my chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, just heavy, like a truth I had been slowly approaching for years without ever fully acknowledging. A waiter approached and offered to pour me champagne, and I nodded, thanking him softly as the pale gold liquid filled the glass, the bubbles rising quickly before fading into stillness, much like the room around me, vibrant on the surface, but beneath it all, something quieter, something unresolved. I lifted the glass but didn't drink, instead letting it rest lightly in my hand as I looked around the room once more, taking in the laughter, the smiles, the carefully constructed joy of a day that was supposed to celebrate love and family, and I realized, with a clarity that surprised me, that the words on that small card were not just an insult, they were a message, one that had been building for a long time, whispered through missed invitations, forgotten phone calls, decisions made without me, and now finally written down in ink for everyone to see. I set the glass back on the table, my expression unchanged, my posture composed, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that moments like this were not meant to be confronted in public, they were meant to be understood, quietly, completely, and then, when the time was right, answered in a way no one could ignore. I remained seated at table 12, my hands still resting lightly in my lap as the room continued around me as if nothing unusual had happened, and perhaps to everyone else, nothing had, because the cruelty of it was subtle, wrapped in elegance, hidden behind polished manners and soft laughter. The kind of cruelty that does not raise voices or cause scenes but instead settles quietly into the corners of a person's dignity, I noticed more glances now, brief but deliberate, people reading the card, then looking at me, trying to reconcile the label with the woman sitting calmly in front of them, and I could almost hear the questions forming behind their polite smiles, wondering what kind of grandmother would be called absent at her own granddaughter's wedding, wondering what story they had been told about me before I ever walked into that room. I reached for my glass again and took a small sip this time, letting the champagne rest on my tongue before swallowing, grounding myself in something simple and controlled, because everything else about this moment had been carefully designed to make me feel otherwise. A young woman at the table beside me leaned slightly toward her companion and whispered something I could not fully hear, but I caught enough to understand the tone. There was amusement there, a hint of judgment, and I did not blame her entirely. People believe what they are shown, and tonight, I had been presented as someone who did not show up, someone who did not care enough to be present, when in truth, I had spent decades showing up in ways that never made it onto any seating chart or printed card. I let my eyes move slowly across the room again, searching not for confrontation but for understanding, and that is when I noticed Olivia walking past with a group of bridesmaids, her arm linked with one of them, her laughter light and effortless. She looked radiant, exactly as a bride should, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the pride I had carried for so many years, the pride of watching her grow, of being there for the quiet milestones no one else seemed to remember, the school plays, the doctor appointments, the afternoons spent helping with homework at my kitchen table, all the moments that had built a relationship that I thought meant something more than this. But as she passed my table, her gaze flickered toward me just for a second, long enough to acknowledge my presence but not long enough to truly see me, and then she looked away, continuing her conversation without missing a step, and in that small, almost invisible gesture, I felt something shift inside me, not a sharp pain, not anger, but a quiet clarity, as if a puzzle I had been trying to solve for years had finally come together without any missing pieces. A man seated across from me cleared his throat gently and introduced himself, his voice kind, his manner respectful. He mentioned that he had worked with my late husband years ago, and for a few minutes we spoke about familiar things, shared memories that felt more genuine than anything else in that room, and I realized how easily people can treat you with respect when they are not influenced by someone else's narrative, when they are simply responding to who you are in front of them, not who they have been told you are. The music shifted then, signaling the beginning of the speeches, and the room gradually quieted as guests turned their attention toward the front. I set my glass down and folded my hands once more, watching as Diane stepped up to the microphone, her smile warm, her voice steady as she began to speak about family, about love, about the importance of support and presence, and the irony of her words did not escape me. She spoke about how Olivia had always been surrounded by people who cared deeply for her, people who had guided her and helped her become the woman she was today, and as she listed names, thanking those who had contributed to the wedding, to Olivia's life, to everything that had led to this moment, I listened carefully, not expecting to hear my name but still aware of its absence when it did not come. It was not surprising, but it was confirming, another small piece of evidence added to the growing understanding that this was not a single act, not a one-time decision, but a pattern, something that had been unfolding quietly over time, each omission, each slight, each carefully crafted narrative building toward this public display. I kept my expression unchanged as the applause filled the room, as glasses were raised, as smiles were exchanged, and I realized that what I was witnessing was not just a wedding, it was a performance, one where roles had been assigned long before the guests arrived, and mine, it seemed, had been rewritten without my consent. But the thing about roles is that they only hold power if you choose to keep playing them, and as I sat there in that beautifully decorated ballroom, surrounded by people who believed a version of me that was not true, I began to understand that I did not have to correct them. I did not have to defend myself in that moment, because clarity does not always require an immediate response. Sometimes it only requires patience, and the willingness to let the truth reveal itself in its own time. The speeches continued, one after another, each filled with laughter and carefully chosen memories that painted a picture of a family so united, so supportive, that it almost felt like a different story entirely, and I sat there listening, not with bitterness, but with a growing sense of distance, as if I were no longer part of the scene but instead an observer watching something unfold from the outside. I noticed how easily people accepted what they were told, how quickly a narrative becomes truth when it is repeated enough times in the right setting, and I wondered how long this version of me had been circulating, How many conversations I had never been part of had quietly shaped the way others now saw me. I kept my posture straight, my expression composed, allowing no sign of discomfort to surface, because if there was one thing I understood, it was that dignity is often most powerful when it is preserved in silence. A server approached with a tray of appetizers and I declined with a gentle shake of my head, not out of discomfort but because I needed my thoughts clear, steady, uninterrupted, and as I sat there, I became aware of a conversation happening just behind me. Low voices, familiar tones, and without turning, I recognized them immediately, Diane and Olivia, their words soft but not soft enough to escape entirely. "I told you it would be funny," Diane said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "People notice things like that, it sets the tone." Olivia responded with a small laugh, the kind that tries to sound casual but carries a hint of uncertainty. "Do you think she noticed?" she asked, and Diane's reply came quickly, almost dismissive. "If she did, she will not say anything. She never does." There was a pause, brief but telling, and then Olivia added, "It is just a joke, right? I mean, she was never really around the way people think." And that sentence settled more heavily than anything else that had happened that evening, not because it was loud or cruel on the surface, but because of how easily it was said, how comfortably it fit into the story they had chosen. I remained still, my gaze fixed ahead, giving no indication that I had heard them, but inside, something shifted from quiet observation to complete understanding. This was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, it was a decision, one that had been made and reinforced over time. I thought back to the years when Olivia would call me after school, asking if I could pick her up because her parents were busy, the weekends she spent in my home when Diane said she needed time for herself, the holidays I hosted when no one else wanted the responsibility, and I realized that absence, in their version of the story, did not mean physical absence, it meant something else entirely, something more convenient, something that allowed them to reshape the past into a version that suited their present. I exhaled slowly, keeping my movements minimal, controlled, because reacting now would change nothing. It would only create a moment they could later point to as proof of whatever they already believed about me. Instead, I let the silence settle again, allowing their conversation to fade as they moved away, and I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly on the table, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligned, clear, precise. I understood now that what I had been witnessing was not just a single act of disrespect. It was the result of a narrative carefully constructed over time, one where my contributions had been minimized, my presence redefined, and my role gradually reduced to something that could be dismissed with a few printed words. And the realization did not bring anger, it brought something far more useful, clarity, the kind that allows you to see not only what has happened but what must happen next. I glanced down at the name card once more, reading the words again, not with disbelief this time but with a quiet acknowledgement, as if accepting that this was how they had chosen to define me, and in that acceptance, I felt a shift in control, subtle but undeniable, because definitions, I have learned, only hold power when you accept them without question, and I had no intention of doing that, not anymore. The music grew louder again as the speeches ended and the evening transitioned into celebration. Guests began to move, to laugh, to dance, and I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the noise to rise around me while I stayed perfectly still, because sometimes the most important decisions are made not in the middle of action, but in the quiet space just before it begins, and in that space, I made mine. The music shifted into something livelier, a soft jazz tune that encouraged movement, and guests began to rise from their seats, chairs sliding back against polished floors, laughter growing louder as the evening settled into what everyone expected it to be, a celebration. And I watched it all for a moment longer before finally standing, smoothing the front of my jacket with a calm, deliberate motion, because leaving immediately would have suggested discomfort, and I had no intention of giving anyone that impression. Instead I moved slowly through the room, past tables filled with conversations that paused just slightly as I passed, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt, and I understood that the small card I still wore had already done its work. It had introduced me before I could introduce myself. It had shaped perceptions without a single word spoken by me, and yet, as I walked, I noticed something else as well. Not everyone looked away, a few people held my gaze a moment longer, their expressions not mocking or dismissive, but curious, uncertain, as if what they were seeing did not fully match what they had been told, and that quiet contradiction gave me something far more valuable than sympathy. It gave me confirmation that truth does not disappear so easily, even when someone tries to rewrite it, I made my way toward the edge of the dance floor where the lights were softer, less focused, and for a moment I allowed myself to step out of the center of it all, not as a retreat, but as a position from which I could see everything more clearly, and as I stood there, I found my thoughts drifting back, not to tonight, but to years earlier, to moments that had seemed small at the time but now felt connected, like pieces of a pattern I had not fully recognized. I remembered the first time Diane had suggested that Olivia stay with them during the holidays instead of coming to my house, framing it as a way to build their own traditions, and I had agreed without hesitation, believing it was a natural step. I remembered the phone calls that became less frequent, the invitations that came later and later until sometimes they did not come at all, always accompanied by a reasonable explanation, a scheduling conflict, a misunderstanding, something that made it easy to accept without question, because questioning would have meant admitting that something deeper was changing, something I was not ready to confront at the time. I recalled the conversations where decisions were mentioned after they had already been made, the way my role shifted from being included to being informed, and eventually, to being omitted entirely, and each memory, on its own, had seemed insignificant, easy to overlook, but now, standing in that room, wearing a label that reduced me to 4 dismissive words, they formed a clear and undeniable picture. This had not happened overnight. It had been built slowly, carefully, over time, and I had allowed it, not out of weakness, but out of trust, the kind of trust that assumes family does not need to be questioned, that intentions are good even when actions feel distant. I let out a quiet breath, not of regret, but of acknowledgement, because understanding does not always come when you expect it. Sometimes it arrives all at once, reshaping everything you thought you knew, and as I stood there, I noticed a man approaching, someone older, his expression thoughtful. He paused a few feet away and then stepped closer, glancing briefly at the card on my chest before meeting my eyes. "I hope you do not mind me saying this," he began, his tone respectful, "but that does not seem accurate." I tilted my head slightly, offering a small, polite smile. "What does not?" I asked, though I already knew. He gestured lightly toward the card. "That," he said simply, and for a moment, I considered how to respond, not because I did not have an answer, but because I understood the weight of what I said next would carry beyond this conversation. I could correct him, explain everything, tell him about the years, the support, the presence that had never been absent, but instead, I chose something simpler, something more precise. "Appearances can be arranged," I said, my voice calm, steady, and he nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I had actually spoken, and with that, he excused himself, leaving me once again alone with my thoughts, but not entirely alone in the way I had been earlier, because now there was a shift, subtle but real, the beginning of something that did not require immediate action but would, in time, require a response. I looked once more across the room, finding Diane among a group of guests, her posture confident, her expression relaxed, and Olivia nearby, surrounded by friends, glowing under the soft lights, and I realized that they believed this moment was complete, that whatever message they had intended to send had already been delivered, and perhaps, in a way, they were right. It had been delivered, received, and understood, but what they did not yet realize was that understanding does not end a story, it changes its direction, and as the music carried on and the celebration continued, I reached up and gently removed the card from my jacket, holding it between my fingers for a brief moment before placing it carefully on the table beside me, not as a rejection, but as a quiet acknowledgement that I no longer needed to carry it with me, because its purpose had already been fulfilled. After placing the card back on the table, I did not return it to my jacket, and that small decision, though invisible to most, felt significant to me, as if I had quietly stepped out of a role that had been assigned without my consent. I picked up my clutch and moved away from the edge of the dance floor, not toward the exit, not yet, but toward a quieter corner near the tall windows where the night stretched out beyond the glass, dark and still, offering a contrast to the bright, carefully managed celebration inside, and for a moment I stood there, looking out at the faint reflection of myself, a woman who, to anyone passing by, appeared composed, even serene, but beneath that calm exterior, there was a shift taking place, something measured, deliberate. I was no longer trying to understand what had happened, I already understood. What remained now was deciding what to do with that understanding. I reached into my bag and took out my phone, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly why they are doing what they are about to do. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed to call in quite some time, not because it was unimportant, but because I had trusted that things would never reach a point where that call would be necessary. And yet here I was, standing in the middle of a celebration that had made something very clear. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening as it rang. Once, twice, and then connected. Eleanor, the voice on the other end said, calm and familiar. I was not expecting to hear from you tonight. I allowed myself a small pause before responding, not out of uncertainty, but because I wanted my words to be precise. I will not take much of your time, I said, my tone steady. But I believe it is time we revisit certain arrangements. There was a brief silence, not of confusion, but of understanding, the kind that comes when two people have previously discussed matters that were never meant to be urgent, only prepared for. Is everything all right? He asked, and I considered the question carefully, not because I did not have an answer, but because the truth was more complex than a simple yes or no. Everything is clear, I replied, and that seemed to be enough. He did not ask for further explanation. He did not need to. Then I will make myself available tomorrow morning, he said. We can go over everything in detail. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. That would be appropriate, I said, and after a brief exchange of formalities, the call ended. I lowered the phone and returned it to my bag, feeling neither relief nor anxiety, only a quiet sense of alignment, as if a decision that had been waiting beneath the surface for years had finally been brought into the light. I turned back toward the room, the music still playing, guests now fully engaged in dancing, laughter louder, more uninhibited, the kind that comes when people believe the most important moments of the evening have already passed, and perhaps for them, they had, but for me, something had only just begun. I walked slowly back toward the tables, my gaze steady, my movements unhurried, and as I passed by familiar faces, I noticed something subtle had shifted. Perhaps it was in the way I carried myself, or perhaps it was simply that I was seeing things differently now. But the glances I received no longer felt intrusive, they felt irrelevant, because whatever assumptions had been made about me in this room no longer held any weight in the decisions I was about to make. I reached my table and picked up the card once more, not to wear it, but to look at it one final time, the words still as sharp and deliberate as they had been when I first read them, and for a moment, I allowed myself to appreciate the precision of it, because in a way, it had accomplished something that years of subtle changes had not. It had made everything unmistakably clear. I placed the card down again, this time leaving it exactly where it was, and I knew I would not be returning to that seat, not tonight, and not in the way they might expect in the future. I turned away from the table and began to walk toward the exit, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet composure I had carried throughout the evening, and as I moved through the room, past the music, the laughter, the carefully arranged joy, I did not feel excluded, I felt resolved. Because absence, I had come to understand, is not always something imposed on you. Sometimes it is something you choose, and when it is chosen with clarity, it becomes something entirely different, not a loss, but a decision. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, leaving the warmth and noise of the reception behind me, I did not look back, not because I was hurt, but because I already knew exactly what I would do next. The night air was cooler than I expected, a quiet contrast to the warmth and noise I had just left behind, and as I walked toward my car, the sound of laughter and music faded with each step until it became nothing more than a distant echo, something separate from me now, something I no longer needed to be part of. I unlocked the door and sat inside, closing it gently, allowing the silence to settle around me, and for a moment, I simply rested my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine, not because I was unsure of where to go, but because I understood the importance of this pause, this space between what had happened and what would come next. I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror, studying it briefly, not searching for emotion, but confirming what I already felt. There was no anger there, no visible hurt, only a quiet resolve that had replaced the uncertainty I had carried for far too long. I started the engine and pulled away from the venue, the headlights cutting through the dark road ahead, and as I drove, my thoughts did not wander. They remained focused, structured, almost methodical, as if I were reviewing something I had already decided. I knew exactly what the morning would bring, a meeting, documents, conversations that would not be emotional but precise, necessary. I arrived home just after 11, the house welcoming me with its familiar stillness, every room exactly as I had left it, untouched, unchanged, and for the first time in a long while, that stillness did not feel lonely. It felt grounding. I set my keys down on the entry table and walked into the living room, turning on a single lamp, its soft light filling the space without overwhelming it, and I moved slowly, deliberately, as I always had, but now with a clarity that made each action feel more intentional. I placed my clutch on the coffee table and sat down, not to rest, but to think, to revisit the decisions I had already begun to set in motion. I reached for a folder I kept in the drawer beside me, one I had not opened in months, perhaps longer, and as I flipped it open, I found everything exactly where it should be, neatly organized, documented, prepared, not because I had expected this moment, but because I had always believed in being ready for any possibility, even those you hope will never come. I reviewed the papers one by one, not reading them in full, but reminding myself of what they represented: years of planning, agreements made with care, provisions set in place not out of distrust, but out of responsibility, and as I looked at them now, I understood that what had once been a precaution was about to become something else entirely, something active, something that would reshape more than just a single evening. I closed the folder and set it back in its place, my decision already made. There was no need to overthink it, no need to second-guess what had become so clear. I stood and walked toward the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water and taking a slow sip, allowing the quiet rhythm of the house to settle around me once more, and I realized then that what had happened tonight had not taken something from me, it had revealed something to me, something I could no longer ignore. I turned off the light and made my way down the hallway, each step steady, measured, as I prepared for the next day, not with anxiety, but with purpose. Because the morning would not be about confrontation or explanation, it would be about action, the kind that does not need to be announced to be understood, the kind that unfolds quietly but leaves no room for misunderstanding. And as I entered my bedroom and closed the door behind me, I knew that whatever version of me they had chosen to present to the world that evening would no longer matter, because the decisions I was about to make would not rely on perception, they would rely on something far more solid, something that had been built long before this night, something they had clearly underestimated. And as I lay down, allowing the quiet of the room to settle completely, I did not replay the evening in my mind, I did not dwell on the words or the looks or the laughter, because none of that required my attention anymore. What mattered now was what would happen next, and that I had already set into motion. I woke before the alarm, not because I had slept poorly, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day, organized and settled in a way that felt unfamiliar yet steady, the kind of clarity that does not rush you but simply exists, waiting for you to step into it. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house, the same quiet that had greeted me the night before, and I realized that nothing around me had changed, but something within me had, and that difference was enough to make everything feel sharper, more defined. I rose and moved through my morning routine without distraction, each action deliberate, measured, as if I were preparing not for confrontation, but for a conversation that had been delayed for far too long. I dressed in something simple, understated, choosing pieces that did not draw attention but reflected the composure I intended to carry with me, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw no trace of the woman they had described the night before, no sign of absence, only presence, quiet and complete. I left the house just after 8, the air crisp, the sky clear, and as I drove toward the office, my thoughts remained focused on what needed to be done, not on what had already happened, because revisiting the past would not change it, but the decisions made today would shape everything that followed. The building stood exactly as it always had, familiar and unassuming, and when I stepped inside, I was greeted by the same calm efficiency that had always defined this place. I gave my name at the front desk and was directed upstairs, where he was already waiting, seated behind a desk lined with neatly arranged documents, his expression composed, attentive, as if he had already anticipated the nature of this meeting. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said as I entered, rising slightly in acknowledgement, and I returned the greeting with a small nod, taking the seat across from him without hesitation. There was no need for small talk, no need to ease into the conversation, because we both understood that the purpose of this meeting was not casual. "You mentioned revisiting certain arrangements," he said, his tone professional, direct, and I placed my hands lightly on the table before speaking. "I would like to review all current provisions related to family distributions and conditional allocations," I said, my voice steady, free of emotion, and he nodded once, reaching for a file that had already been set aside, as if he had anticipated this exact request. "Everything is in order as it stands," he began, opening the folder and turning it toward me. However, any modifications can be made effective immediately, provided you are certain. I glanced down at the documents, not reading them in full, but recognizing their structure, their intent, the safeguards that had been built into them long ago, and I understood now that those safeguards had not been unnecessary, they had simply been unused, until now, I am certain. I replied, and there was no hesitation in my voice, no trace of doubt, because certainty does not always come quickly, but when it does, it leaves no room for reconsideration. He studied me for a brief moment, not questioning my decision, but acknowledging the weight of it. Very well, he said, making a note before continuing, we will proceed with the necessary adjustments, including the enforcement of all conditional clauses that have previously remained inactive. I nodded, understanding exactly what that meant, not as a reaction, not as a form of retaliation, but as a correction, a realignment of what had always been intended. There is one more detail, I added, my tone unchanged, and he paused, waiting. I would like all relevant parties to be formally notified, not immediately, but in a manner that ensures clarity, I said, choosing my words carefully. There should be no room for misinterpretation. He inclined his head slightly. Of course, he replied. The notifications will be prepared and delivered accordingly, and with that, the conversation moved forward, not with emotion, not with conflict, but with precision, each step outlined, each decision documented, until there was nothing left to address. I stood to leave, gathering my things without urgency, and as I reached the door, he spoke once more. If I may say, Eleanor, he began, and I paused, turning slightly. It is rare to see someone approach this with such clarity. I considered his words for a moment before responding. Clarity comes when there is nothing left to question, I said simply, and with that, I stepped out into the hallway. The meeting concluded, the decisions no longer pending but set in motion, and as I walked back toward the exit, I did not feel a sense of loss, only a quiet completion, because what had begun as a moment of quiet humiliation had now become something else entirely, something defined not by what had been done to me, but by what I had chosen to do in response. And as I stepped outside into the daylight, I understood that the real shift had already taken place, not in the documents, not in the notifications that would soon follow, but in the simple fact that I was no longer waiting for acknowledgement. I had created my own. The rest of the day unfolded with a quiet efficiency that mirrored the decisions I had already set in motion, and by the time I returned home that afternoon, there was nothing left to consider, only the natural progression of what had already been arranged. I placed my keys on the table and moved through the house with the same calm rhythm as the night before, but this time there was a subtle difference, not in the space itself, but in the way I occupied it. As if something that had once been uncertain had now settled into place, I did not check my phone immediately. I did not wait for anything, because I understood that what had been initiated would not require constant attention. It would unfold as it was designed to, precise and unambiguous. I prepared a simple meal and sat by the window, allowing the quiet of the late afternoon to settle around me, and for the first time in a long while, my thoughts were not drawn backward. They remained in the present, grounded, steady, until the first notification came, not a call, not a message filled with emotion, but a formal email, its subject line clear, its tone measured. And as I opened it, I saw exactly what I expected, confirmation that the documents had been processed, that the notifications had been prepared and delivered to all relevant parties. There was no elaboration, no unnecessary detail, just a precise acknowledgement that everything was now in effect. I read it once, then closed it, setting the phone down without any visible reaction, because the significance of it did not require an immediate response. It simply existed, quietly, firmly, and I knew that somewhere else, at that very moment, those notifications were being received, opened, read, and understood in ways that would not be calm or measured. But I did not need to witness that. I did not need to hear their reactions to know the impact, because I understood the structure of what had been set in motion. I understood how clarity, when delivered through formal channels, leaves no room for denial. The evening passed without interruption, the house remaining as still as it had been the night before, and I allowed that stillness to remain undisturbed, because it was no longer something I associated with absence. It was something I now recognized as space to think, to exist without explanation, to move forward without being pulled back into narratives that no longer applied. It was not until the next morning that the first call came, the name appearing on the screen exactly as I expected, Diane. I looked at it for a moment, not with hesitation, but with a quiet acknowledgement of timing, and then I let it ring, not out of avoidance, but because I understood that some conversations are more effective when they are not immediate, when the initial reaction has time to settle into something more coherent. The phone stopped, and then rang again, the same name, the same urgency, and again, I let it pass, placing the phone face down on the table, not as a dismissal, but as a decision, because I had already said everything that needed to be said, just not in words. The following message arrived shortly after, the tone less controlled, more direct, asking for an explanation, for clarification, for a conversation, and I read it without responding, not because I could not answer, but because the answer had already been delivered, clearly, formally, in a way that did not require interpretation. I stood and moved toward the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same familiar view, unchanged, and I realized that what was unfolding now was not a conflict, it was a consequence, one that had been carefully outlined long before this moment, one that had simply remained dormant until now. I turned away from the window and continued with my morning. Preparing coffee, moving through each step with the same deliberate calm, and as the phone remained silent for a while, I understood that the shift had been recognized, not in words, not in confrontation, but in the absence of control they once believed they had, and that absence, unlike the one they had assigned to me, was not something that could be dismissed or rewritten. It was real, it was immediate, and it would continue to unfold in ways they could no longer influence. And as I sat down with my coffee, the quiet of the house around me, I did not feel the need to check the phone again, because I already knew what it would contain: more messages, more attempts to reach me, to understand, to reverse something that had already been decided. But there are moments when understanding comes too late, when the clarity you once ignored becomes the very thing that defines what happens next, and this was one of those moments, not marked by raised voices or dramatic confrontation, but by something far more final, the quiet realization that the roles had shifted, and that this time, I would not be the one left waiting for acknowledgement. By the afternoon, the messages had multiplied, not in chaos, but in persistence, each one slightly more urgent than the last, each one carrying a different tone: confusion at first, then concern, and finally something closer to realization. I did not read them all immediately, I allowed them to sit, not out of indifference, but because I understood that urgency often reveals more than calm ever does. When people are forced to confront something they did not anticipate, their words become less measured, more honest, and I had no need to interrupt that process. When I eventually picked up the phone, I opened a few of them, just enough to confirm what I already knew. Diane's messages had shifted from demanding explanations to asking for a conversation, her words now carefully chosen, as if she were trying to reconstruct a tone that had already been lost. Olivia's message was different, shorter, less structured, a single line asking if something had gone wrong, as if the answer had not already been placed directly in front of her, and I read that line twice, not because it was unclear, but because of what it revealed: not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a question that suggested distance, the same distance they had once assigned to me. I set the phone down again, not with frustration, but with a quiet sense of closure, because there was nothing left to interpret. Everything had already been made clear, not just by the documents, but by the way they were responding to them. I stood and moved through the house slowly, pausing by the window where the light had begun to soften into the early evening, and I found myself thinking back, not to the wedding, not to the card, but to the years that had led to that moment, the choices I had made, the trust one had given without condition, and I realized that what I had done recently was not a reaction, it was a correction, one that aligned my actions with a truth I had been avoiding. I reached for my coat and stepped outside, not because I needed to go anywhere in particular, but because I wanted to move, to feel the world around me in a way that was not confined by walls or expectations. The air was calm, the street quiet, and as I walked, I noticed how little had changed in the world itself: the same houses, the same distant sounds, the same steady rhythm of life continuing as it always does, unaffected by the quiet decisions that reshape individual lives. And that realization brought a certain comfort, because it reminded me that what had happened, while significant, did not define everything. It simply marked a turning point. I returned home shortly after, the sky now dimming into evening, and as I stepped inside, my phone buzzed once more. I glanced at the screen and saw a different name this time: Olivia, calling. I let it ring once, twice, and then I answered, not because I felt obligated, but because I understood that some moments require acknowledgement, even if they do not require resolution. Grandma, her voice came through, hesitant, uncertain. And I remained silent for a brief moment before responding. Yes, I said, my tone calm, steady. She paused, as if searching for the right words, and when she spoke again, there was a softness there that had not been present before. I do not understand what is happening, she said, and I listened, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing her to continue. They said something about changes, about conditions. I thought everything was already decided, and there it was, the assumption laid bare, the belief that what had been given would always remain unchanged, that presence, contribution, support, all of it would continue without question. I took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but to ensure that my words would be as clear as the actions that had already been taken. Everything was decided, I said, my voice even, based on what I believed to be true at the time. There was silence on the other end, not confusion this time, but understanding beginning to form, and she spoke again, more carefully. Did I do something wrong? She asked, and the question lingered, not because it was difficult, but because of what it required, not an explanation, not a list of moments or memories, but a simple acknowledgement of reality. You made a choice, I said, and I responded to it. The line remained quiet, and I did not fill that silence, because some realizations need space to settle. They cannot be rushed or softened without losing their meaning. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice lower now. I did not think it would matter, and I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition of how easily people underestimate the weight of their actions when they have never had to consider the consequences. It always matters, I replied, and with that, there was nothing more to add, no argument, no raised voices, just the quiet exchange of truth. And after a brief pause, the call ended. I placed the phone down and stood there for a moment, the house once again still around me, but this time, the stillness felt complete, not waiting, not uncertain, just settled, and as I moved to turn off the lights for the evening, I understood that what had begun as a quiet act of dismissal had ended in something far more definitive, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been done, and in that difference, everything had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that required no further explanation.